Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 244th New Social Environment. I'm Malvika Jolly, the events assistant here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for an extra special conversation with artists Young-Sun Han, Maya Varadaraj, Tahir Carl Karmali, and Liz Nielsen, Artfare's Aki Karja and Carolina Wheat, in conversation with my beloved comrade and special projects editor here at the Rail, Nick Bennett. We're also thrilled to have poet and writer Darien Hsu Gee, here with us today, who will read to close today's program. To begin, I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and the Shinnecock Indian Nation, the traditional owners of Lenapehoking, the unceded land and waters on which we stand. Alongside that, we recognize that white settler colonialism is part of the continued legacy of white supremacy in this country, and that has many nuanced and not so nuanced contemporary expressions. So before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to honor the memory of all those we have lost to white supremacy and police violence in this country, let alone in the last year, as well as to honor those who are working to undo legacies of violence and disinvestment, and acknowledge that justice will come from the streets, from the nation demanding accountability and refusing to move on until Black Lives Matter in the eyes of the state. And now to introduce today's special guests and kick off this conversation in style, I'll hand the mic over to you, Nick.
Well, firstly, thank you, Malvika. As mentioned, today we're here with the founder, curator, and artist of Artfare. So I would like to thank all of you very much for making the time to join us today. I'd like to start by saying that I'm approaching this event by recognizing that this particular moment, there is a lot of conversation and consideration going on alternative ways to operate within arts institutions and organizations. And these conversations have been going on for a very long time, but it seems over the past year, there is more of a sense of urgency to these conversations. Questions about how artists connect and relate to their audience, what representation means, not just in the work itself, but how artists interact with for-profit businesses, nonprofit organizations, and institutions in general. There have been many engaging conversations here at the Rail, part of our Common Ground series that my colleague Malvika has been a big part of. And another kind of sub-series that comes to mind is one we did just recently called Art School Confidential, that is sort of rethinking the importance and relevance of BFAs and MFA programs. So with that sort of preamble, I'm really thrilled to welcome you all here today. And I'm going to do my best to read a very quick and concise bio for each of you. So, Young-Sun Han is an artist, performer, and activist who articulates human stories through intersecting media: photography, moving image, durational performance, and installation. His work aims to document and reveal connections between communities through their shared struggles, histories, and desires. In the past year, their work has focused on public action and protest, coalition building, and collaborations with other queer friends. Next, we have Maya Varaj, who is an interdisciplinary artist and designer. She received her BFA in Apparel Design from the Rhode Island School of Design before completing a master's degree at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Vargaraj's work has been exhibited internationally at Sapar Contemporary, Vitra Design Museum, Mana Contemporary, and right now at Established Gallery, among others. Tahir Carl Karmali is an artist based in Brooklyn. His works span photography, installation, papermaking, sculpture, and sound. His work was on exhibit at the Shed in August 2019 and is part of Second Careers, Two Tributaries in African Art at the Cleveland Museum of Art, which is on view through March 2021. He's currently an adjunct professor of sculpture at Brooklyn College. Next, we have, based in Brooklyn and Newburgh, Carolina Wheat is co-founder and director of Elijah Wheat Showroom. Wheat writes about art and culture and has curated numerous political and socially conscientious exhibitions in Detroit, Berlin, London, Chicago, and New York. Wheat collaborates with Artfare as a curator, artist liaison, and exhibition designer. And last but certainly not least, we have here also with us in Brooklyn, Aki Karja, who since 2018 has been splitting his time between Artfare and Gemic, a New York-based progressive strategy consultancy. Before starting his career in finance, Aki was a professional skateboarder and is a former Finnish champion in skateboarding and snowboarding. So I know my colleagues have posted a link to the event page in the chat with full bios if you'd like to read more. But I want to start off by welcoming you all. If you all want to unmute and just quickly say hello, and thank you all for joining us today.
Hi. I'm so sorry to cut in.
Yeah.
Liz hello. Well? Good to be here.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Malvika, what was that?
Can we introduce Liz as well?
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. I made a huge faux pas. I'm sorry, Liz. Let me go back. Thank you for reminding me, Malvika. Liz Nielsen is an experimental photographer based in Brooklyn. Her photographs are made without a camera and can also be described as light paintings or photograms. She works in the analog color darkroom, exposing light-sensitive paper and processing it through traditional photographic chemicals. Liz, so sorry I missed you there, and that's what great colleagues are for. So thank you, Malvika. Okay, so the conversation today will be fairly chronological and straightforward. I would really love to start with Aki and to talk about the genesis of Artfare. So Artfare, which if you're not aware of, anyone in the audience, there are also links to have a look at it in the chat. But Artfare is a virtual platform with the ultimate goal to connect artists directly to collectors in a more democratic and accessible way. People can sign up for Artfare and directly interface with those artists and with their work without a sort of more traditional mediator like a gallery or organizations that kind of quote unquote speak for the artist. But going back to your bio, Aki, you have a really interesting background that has gone from skateboarding to finance. So I was hoping you could kind of talk a bit about your background and what inspired you to create Artfare.
Sure. Thanks, Nick. Absolutely. And thank you for everybody at Brooklyn Rail, including us today here as part of your programming. So Artfare, it really came up as an idea, I want to say like 7-8 years ago. And maybe it comes from the way I grew up. I grew up in a small town in Finland, sort of in Finland. Typically in the US, I still try to explain what Finland is. It's a small country in the Nordics in Northern Europe. And there wasn't that much opportunity growing up. And I started skateboarding at a very young age. And that kind of became the way that I identified myself. And of course, like the mecca of skateboarding, everything was in the US. And I started traveling at a young age and got a chance to go around the US as a teenager and skateboard all over and fell in love. And some people might know about the culture of skateboarding, but it's very much everything revolves around art. And some people might even consider it as a form of artistic expression. I'm not sure I would go that far, but I ended up spending a lot of time with artists growing up and hanging out at artist studios, etc. And then in the year 2000, I moved to New York and started this kind of more of a corporate career, and never wanted to let go of that part of my life because it's still kind of a big part of who I am, and was always kind of involved in the art world in that sense, whether it's collecting from my friends or visiting their studios and seeing what they were making. And kind of realized that there was this vacuum in the art world of something that would really allow artists to empower themselves to kind of take control of their own destiny and hopefully build a following. And that's kind of where Artfare came from. And we started it out I think we launched in early 2019, and we're a small team. We're still a small company, and we do as much as we can with limited resources that we have available, but we've been able to grow it to 600 artists today, and we're very excited about the quality of the artists and the artwork that's available on the site. And we have an audience of about 40,000 people. So what we do is we try to connect those people in the audience with the artist. Before the pandemic, we were doing a lot of studio visits. We have an active email program, and then one of our curators, Carolina Wheat, who's here today, she hosts a virtual studio visit every Thursday with one of the artists. So our mission is really sort of twofold. One, we want to make art more approachable and artists more approachable to people. And two, we want to empower the artists to build their own following and really do it in a way that is empathetic on where they're coming from. So do it in a way that's credible for their careers and helps them to kind of build their career elsewhere. So understanding that we're not the only thing that they're focused on.
Totally. I'm definitely going to come back to that that idea of accessibility throughout the talk today. But I'd love to now take it over to Carolina. And my question may be a bit obvious, but as the curator of Artfare, how do you approach the idea of curating? Because, you know, this is a word that has come to me many different things and experiences. What kind of parameters do you use in curating Artfare's program? And how does your previous curatorial practice sort of factor into this?
Hi, Nick. Thank you. Thanks, Aki, and for all the artists here in the Brooklyn Rail for hosting. Fong, much appreciated. I'm excited for your question, Nick, because curatorial practice, or otherwise this idea of taste making and understanding what's a curated platform like Artfare is, I can tell you that it's a place where artists that have professional record of showing, as well as a deep studio practice and a conceptual relevance when it comes to being able to discuss their work, the research they put with their work. And may I also add that I'm just one of the curators. We have a team that, Kelly Schreier brought me on as incredible curators, worked with Artfare for a while as one of the founding curators and helped build a lot of the artists that are currently on as legacy artists. And then Danielle Holben, who's also a curator I work closely with, and now Rihanna Gideon, who we all sit and not only invite artists onto the platform, however, we, after a while of launching in early 2019, as Aki had mentioned, maybe 6 or so months later, after we were kind of getting our feelers out for all of the artists that are in New York City, so it was New York centric at first. And then we realized that, of course, artists can be anywhere in this global world, and now more than ever are communicating pre-COVID, but post-COVID world too. So we wanted to expand our net and our reach. And because my background for 20 years, I was in enrollment management at colleges of higher education for art and design specifically, worked as the director of admission at Parsons. Most recently, about 6 years ago, I was there. And so I would write applications and I would vet those applications for both grad and undergrad, but also at the School of the Arts in Chicago and other schools across the country. So I came with a knowledge set, how to use SlideRoom or, write an application. And then when you get to the parameters and those vetting is what I mentioned, we look for artists that have had solo exhibitions already, that have had works in exhibitions that are also group oriented. Perhaps they've had the privilege to have a residency where they could take time off of their day jobs or otherwise, or perhaps they've really invested in their practice with a 40+ hour a week studio practice. So some of those things that we're looking for in that submission form is often vetted through a monthly review process. And then, the rate of acceptance really varies over the months, but we now have artists in Chicago, in LA, in Utah, Seattle, Florida, all over the place. And, Aki and I were, and other curators, we've often talked about or spoken about possibly branching out into Europe, but that's another UD currently. So I hope that answers your question in a long-winded way.
It does. I really hope it is just my screen, but I think you were cutting out just a little bit there, Carolina, so you know, but I caught what you said, and thank you. It's really wonderful to see things grow outside of New York City, because New York City, of course, is a great place, but you know, artists are everywhere. So speaking of artists, I would love to now open this up to the 4 artists that have joined us today. Each of these artists are part of the Artfare roster, if you will. And I would love to have each artist give a brief presentation with some images to talk about their work and what they do, what they're up to. And then once we're through that, we will have a kind of a group conversation. So first is Young. So Young, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Malvika, for hosting and for that really wonderful acknowledgement. My name is Young Sun Han, and I'm going to be trying to encapsulate a little bit of what I do through these images. But I would describe myself as a photo maximalist in many ways, and I use both found and constructed images to tell stories, and through research look at what different communities have gone through in history and how that might relate to our present times. So this first image that we're looking at is an installation shot of my last solo show pre-pandemic. This opened and closed February and March of 2020. So this was the last sort of kind of in-person show that was at the Print Center in Philadelphia. And the show is called The Unforever Parallel. And the themes of the show traced my family's migration journey from North Korea into South Korea and then eventually into the US. And at that same time in 1948, there were some other kind of parallel histories happening on a small island called Jeju in South Korea, which was also a haven for refugees. So the show presented a lot of large-scale collages, traditional photographs, and mixed media ephemera. So we can go to the next slide. This image is called Passages from a Memoir Mapping Manguri. So my grandfather was a doctor who was able to leave North Korea just before the outbreak of the Korean War. And he actually wrote about his experiences of escape, and using his original memoir, I was able to go to locations that were relevant to our family's journey. And this is in South Korea near Seoul, where there's a large cemetery and several 100 kilometers of mountains. And so I had kind of this futile journey of trying to find where some of my ancestors were buried. And a lot of other sort of notable people during the wartime are also buried in this landscape. And so this is a double exposure of the kind of cartographic space, like the map showing the landscape, in addition to some images of the physical natural landscape as well. So next slide. This is going further down south into Busan, which is at the very southern tip of South Korea. And Busan is where my grandparents, my aunts and uncles all arrived as refugees from North Korea on a ship. And the central 3 images is modern day Busan and kind of the horizon line where their boat would have come in. And because my grandfather was also a doctor, he saw a lot of other refugee ships coming in and was working to help folks as they were getting off the boat. And the text that's handwritten on to the wall is a passage from the memoir. So it kind of ties in this past story of what he witnessed alongside my kind of physical presence of being in what is now a very sort of tourist heavy area. So just that transformation of the landscape I was really interested in. So next slide. And this is another installation shot showing 2 different images further on my journey to Jeju Island. The bottom diptych shows a woman who survived the massacre, the 4/3 massacre of Jeju. It was in 1948, actually enacted by the South Korean government against its own people. It was a kind of politicide that was buried history for over 50, 60 years. And she's giving testimony about what she witnessed in her village as a child. And the image next to her is a landscape photograph of one of the massacre sites, which is now kind of cordoned off with this fence. And above her is an image of a naval base that was built around 2011 in this village called Kangjong. The local people there protested the erection of that naval base, and it was finished being built right around the same time that a new airport was installed on Jeju Island that excavated all of the bones of people who had been killed there decades prior. So we'll go to the next image. This is a detail of that work of the naval base on Jeju Island in Kangjong village. And so the image is about 35 by 44 inches, and it's printed onto metal. And then I've kind of sandpapered off the architecture of the naval base. And so, the people were protesting the construction of this naval base because obviously it was an eyesore in the landscape, but it also wrecked the coastal line and was an environmental loss to the island. It also disrupted the local fishing trade as well. And you're not allowed to photograph this military installation. It's huge and it encompasses, the whole perimeter of this village, but you're not technically allowed to photograph it. But because I was so far separated from this fence and the soldiers, I was able to shoot it with a medium format camera. And so this is part of a series where I kind of erase this dystopic architecture from the landscape, and it just leaves these soldiers floating in space. So next image. And this is another image of the sort of border wall and a watchtower, again, on civilian land in Kangjong village in South Korea. Again, you're not allowed to photograph this, but because there have been so many weekly protests and actions for over 6-7 years, I think soldiers are now used to seeing people kind of walking along this path. And it is photographable, even though you're not allowed to. Next image. And then this is just a detail shot of a previous iteration of the show where there was a reading room where a lot of printed ephemera, news articles, brochures from travel sites are kind of all put together in this reading room. And there's a small table and kind of altar mimicking some South Korean traditions of how you would create an altar for your ancestors. And during the run of the show, I invited people to come in, have a drink, have snacks with me, and then I would sort of orate some of these stories one-to-one or for small groups. So there was kind of a conversational aspect that accompanied the exhibition. Next slide. So now jumping into today, I kind of mentioned I'm a bit of a photo maximalist. I like to throw a lot of things onto the wall and kind of create these juxtapositions. And you can see with my Zoom background, these are kind of detail shots of photographs I've been making in the last 2 years. And I have thousands of images from different queer communities around the world. And so in the upper right corner, it's one of Mexico City's longest running gay bars next to drag queens I encountered in Seoul. Below them is a host of a party in Mexico City called Pervert that was started by a young queer boy who wanted to raise money for his grandma, and it turned into this huge techno party in Mexico. And next to that image is activist Joel Rivera, who's been leading weekly demonstrations called the Stonewall Protest in Manhattan. And they've been doing this every Thursday since the murder of George Floyd, essentially, and they're still going on. So next slide. Again, more juxtaposed images, artist Jack Waters in the top next to my friend Carla Maria at a Radical Fairy gathering in upstate New York, next to an image of protest signs during the Brooklyn Liberation March, which was the largest gathering of protesters in New York in support of Black trans lives this summer. Below that is a participant at the Reclaim Pride protest 2019 wearing that colorful frock. And then the lower left corner are two mourners at Ruth Bader Ginsburg's vigil, also in Manhattan. And then again, various protests from the Brooklyn Liberation March, Bushwig Drag Festival, Reclaim Pride. And so I've been working with this archive of images, in my studio, not having access to my normal print lab. So I got a small printer that can make these quick 5x7-inch prints, and I've been accumulating them, putting them up on my wall. And it's served as sort of this portal into these communities that I'm physically separated from at the moment, but I feel really connected to these people, to these ideas, to these values by having them around me in the studio. And once I'm able to access a larger space and also have my normal printing facilities, I imagine these as much larger prints and thinking of scaling up this whole wall as a much larger installation. So yeah, that's kind of an overview of my practice, and I'm happy to pass it along.
Thank you so much, Young. Next, we have Maya. Maya, the mic is yours.
Hi, Young. Your work is so beautiful. Thank you for sharing. And Artfare and Brooklyn Rail team, thank you so much for inviting us to be a part of this. Super excited to be here. My name is Maya Varadaraj. I am an interdisciplinary artist. And to sort of understand my work, we have to go back to the research and the concepts for the installation I made in 2017. Here's the installation, and this is a process I designed where household appliances are used to crush and reform wrist bangles worn by women in India. These wrist bangles are frequently thought of as just accessories, but they're actually a product of subjugative traditions and have come to symbolize inferiority for women. And for women, the act of breaking bangles is taboo. So I start by grinding them up using this wet grinder as a form of protest. And the wet grinder is a common domestic appliance in India. The grinder is then attached to a vacuum cleaner, which moves the crushed shards to a mixing bowl. And then the mixing bowl is moved to a third station. Malvika, if you could move to the next slide. Where a microwavable kiln is used to melt the glass shards into a Durga chakra. A Durga chakra being the weapon used by goddess Durga to combat ignorance. And I specifically use household appliances here, and where I can, I strip them of their outer sort of aesthetic appeal, because I find that most of these appliance manufacturers create these outer shells to appeal to women. But can we go back to the previous slide? Yes. So I use these household appliances to change the agency of those machines and draw attention to the subjugation of women domestically. And the stations are all fitted with quartz countertops to allude to the kitchen. And we can go to the next slide. So the installation was accompanied by these collages that again have a very specific place in the South Asian household, where they're calendar posters or illustrations. And these are source images from pre-1947, and they reflected the ideal woman at that time. With these two collages, I'm really not paying attention to what's happening politically around these women, but responding more viscerally to how obedient or restricted they seem. After this project, I sort of went into, painted photograph series and a couple of other ink drawings. But in the beginning of 2020, I found all of us were spending more time in domesticity. So I decided to revisit these source images. But this time I really committed to researching the feminist politics that were happening around the same time. Slide, please. And I found that I had been much too harsh with my initial reaction to the women that I'd like to refer to at home, the women at home, meaning the poster and calendar ladies. And I sincerely feel like there was some kind of generational misunderstanding with how I interpreted those images before. Here, I'm wondering whether those women were actually imposing an ideal or actually offering reprieve and a hope of independence, progression, and autonomy for the women that actually lived with them. So with this specific series, I'm really paying attention to the women's gestures and working on emphasizing them. Slide. And I'm pairing that exploration of the gestures with the concentric circles for two reasons. One, because it refers back to my critique of the violence and subjugation of South Asian women in religion. Concentric circles are frequently used in Hindu iconography and aesthetic, but they also encourage introspection, which I really like, because I want the viewer to sit with with the introspection of these women and to sort of elevate their own gestures in the way that I have. The second is because concentric circles also resemble charts for data visualization. And I'm bringing attention back to the objectification of women. And this is more of like an explorative exercise for myself because I'm working on another project where I'm using direct statistics of crimes against women in India, but that's another project. But at the same time, slide please. I'm also interested in going back to my pairing of identities of women with machine aesthetics, because I found that working with the domestic appliances, I found that most images or narratives of women with machines are highly sexualized and are used to sort of commodify either the woman's body or the machine itself. So the image on your left is a part of my painted photograph series, where I was actively trying to build a new narrative between women and machines. So one that's removed from either of them selling their bodies. This is a painting from that series where the relationship between the woman and the machine is much more maternal, with the machine sort of tucked to her side. The image on your right is my latest work, where I'm going back to my collages, but fully emerging the woman with the machine using photographs of myself in this exploded motor vector drawing. And that's where I'm at right now. And my work is a continuous exploration of that initial thesis that I started in 2017. And I'm happy to pass along.
Thank you so much, Maya. I will point over to the chat as well. There are some current exhibitions going on that I encourage everyone to visit if they can. Next, we are going to pass the mic over to Tahir.
Hi, thank you again, everyone, for arranging this. It's great to engage and see work from artists, new artists as well. I haven't really researched before, but it's really amazing. Thank you, Maya and Young. And I'm looking forward to seeing, I know Liz for a while, so I know Liz's work, but I'm also looking forward to hearing her speak about her work as well. And I'll just take you through a little bit of my work here. So I guess a good way to describe my work is 70s formalism. And a lot of the artists that I am inspired by are minimalists and sort of artists that played with material and design in an interesting way. So artists like Agnes Dennis and Eva Hesse and Mona Khatoum and Zarina Hashmi, and now also Ellen Atsui, and Nena Okere, and some of my contemporaries as well in Kenya, like Jackie Karuti, and in part, I guess, Wangeshi Mutu. So my work is very much about material investigation and the form that it can take. I span between, I guess, textile, metal, some synthetic materials as well. And in this particular image, you're looking at, it is a series of textiles and fabrics which come from a plant called like a palm tree. So this is actually a raffia fiber, which is an organic fiber. And it's from the Congo, the fiber itself, and the dye, drip dye base that it actually, this material is holding is, comes from the interiors of cell phone batteries. So like the cobalt. Typically we understand cobalt as being blue, but when it is kind of like mixed with a yellow like textile fabric, it actually kind of stains it green. And also sort of this kind of paired with this kind of copper as well. Definitely this particular work is about our acquisition and relationship to acquiring these materials for technology, and also the communities that it destroys along the way because of mining. Both copper mining is also pretty terrible for the environment and the community, but also cobalt and coltan as well. You can go to the next image. This work definitely inspired by a drawing by Agnes Dennis, as well as a drawing as a lotus, and also a poem. And this is actually a poem by Liz Nielsen, which is, it's about, how do I explain this? So I got really interested in sort of following this making of the cell phone and the sort of communities that surround it. And I was really interested in this sort of design vernacular of suicide prevention nettings around these cell phone factories, and how we are all sort of somehow complicit in this particular action of kind of placing people in these positions, and also sort of this system of migration that allows people to be put into these situations. And so I just reconfigured or hacked the vernacular to sort of represent this almost lotus-like shape, which is what was inspired by from the poem. You can go to the next image. This particular work I did this one in Newburgh, and also kind of relationship to landscape and access to landscape. And so these are sort of photocopies of, and also copies of my immigration application documents, and some blank asylum application documents that I pulverized and turned into a pulp, and then filtered out with this sort of large, window screening matrix mesh. And it kind of creates this sort of like ocean-like or sky-like abstraction. And so this is sort of something that really impacts the architecture of the space itself, and also just allows the viewer to sort of get lost in it. And this is also sort of like an offshoot from that series. I mean, of like me kind of really thinking about migration and immigration, and what that means as in terms of like my family and family history comes from sort of migratory migrant labor. And so I was really interested in my relationship to this and what that means in terms of paper and the whole sort of like record of that migration itself, and paper as this tool to sort of limit people, and also sort of allow people to move between spaces. So this particular series is paperwork. And finally, this is a new series of work that I'm looking at. So these are some studies where I'm really interested. I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a lot of sort of like paradox in my work, and I'm really interested in paradoxical relationships. And so here it's kind of, I'm exploring this sort of two-dimensional expression of a three-dimensional space, and these sort of design vernaculars that I was looking at the Watermill Center from their archive of like craft and also some ancient objects as well, and merging that with contemporary objects to kind of create these odd sort of like forms in abstraction. And this sort of is going to bleed into my next work. Definitely, this particular series of work is inspired by Zarina Hashmi. And her passing was really impactful for me because she was my favorite artist. And this is kind of like birthed from that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tahir. Last but certainly not least is Liz. Liz, I will pass the mic over to you. Let's see.
I had
there you are.
Unmuted. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Brooklyn Rail, Manguri, Artfare, Aki, Carolina, Young, Maya, Tahir. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm excited about the conversation that will ensue. I will present my work. And Liz Nielsen, I am an experimental photographer. And what that means is that I'm always trying to push the boundaries of what photography can be. So people often look at my work and they ask me, is this a photograph? And the answer is yes. It is created without a camera. And a lot of the work I do is cameraless, but not all of my work. What I will present today is, and they are unique images. So I'm working directly on top of the light sensitive paper in the analog color darkroom. And so it's 100% dark. And I place a layering system that's rather complex of objects right on top of the paper, and I expose many exposures on the paper, and then I process it through traditional color chemistry. So there are people doing photograms, a lot of people, I'm not the only one, but I may be one of the only ones that I know of that's doing a lot of kind of representational abstractions, very controlled, a lot of planning goes on in it. Next, this one is called the Backyard Cosmos. So I'll go to the next slide. And then this one is called the Cosmic Arch Toro. And a lot of the pieces have elements, because they're made with light, they reference only themselves, and they have oftentimes other partners involved. So sometimes they have an entangled partner. I'm interested in quantum physics. I have a background in philosophy, so I'm thinking about the meaning of life. And then the work that I'm creating has these elements of quantum physics or creative breakthroughs. So the Toros are a series of works that I've done. And when you see one of them, the intent is that there is some sort of a creative breakthrough or a leap in consciousness where you would enter through a Toro, almost like falling back or forward into time. Next slide, please. And so some of them have those elements. Other ones are landscapes, like this landscape called the Floating Island. And they have these elements of two or more, or landscapes that are fused together. So those could be landscapes I've researched online, landscapes I've visited, or landscapes I've visited in my imagination. But I'm interested in how the Earth is constantly shifting in its tectonic plates, and that it is one place 1 million years ago and a whole other place in another 1 million years. And not only are these landscapes all fused, but they may exist only in the future or never at all. They're pulled from the void. Next slide, please. This is another one called the Floating Islands as well. I sometimes have the same titles. I usually create the pieces and then look at them after they're finished, and sometimes their images shift. But you can see the bleeding light on the side of this particular piece. They range in scale. This is a small piece. They range in scale from 4 by 5 inches up to like 100 by 100 inches. So when they're being created, the negative is exactly the same size as the actual print. So it's like a 1-to-1 contact. Next slide, please. This one is on Artfare, and it is called the Folded Circle. So I'm thinking of things like folding space and two locations existing in one place and time, because the quantum idea is two or more. It's like an and. It has both and one or the other, but in different respects. Next slide, please. And so this one also has a quantum concept in it. It's called the French kiss. It's people kissing, but it's also trees in a landscape. So it can be both things. And sometimes I like the idea that something could be a still life and a landscape and a portrait all at once. And then the scale is also shifted here. Also, since they're light paintings, I should say, like, when you look at the image, what light poured onto the paper is usually opposite colors than what you see. So like if you see a blue, that means that there was yellow or orange light filtered onto the paper. So everything is always in the opposites. And since I'm working in total darkness, I have to do all my layers in a way of almost like a printmaker would, where one layer has to come off at a time in a very specific order so that you can expose and count the wavelengths that are hitting onto the paper. You can't see it, but it's just so that it lines up. And then what you see is what you get. Thank you. Then this is Hometown. This is actually a pretty large piece. It's about 50 by 72 inches. And I actually made this piece like just minutes before we went into the lockdown, like maybe a couple days before we went into the lockdown, which is interesting because I feel like everyone went back to their hometown. I mean, some people stayed, but we were all in our homes, but so many people moved back to where they were from. Okay, then this one's called the Pool Portal. And I have a lot of portals. I know Young was mentioning portal earlier. It must be in the collective consciousness right now. But the portals are basically a series of work that I've done, which are these folds in time. So that they are a triangle, they are a pyramid. They come out of ancient ideas of where energy was highlighted in space, alongside of like what the Toro piece did. But they are also folds. They are also like, if you flatten them down, they become a perspective, like an infinite perspective. They could be the bow of a boat. I like the fact that things can shift in front of you and then be one thing one time and another thing another time. Okay, next slide, please. And then this is the volcano landscape. And that's also just the idea of these hot spots on Earth. So I like geothermal activity, thinking about all these volcanoes that maybe are underground, that you only see the one, but there's all these other potential outbreaks of heated energy. So not only am I interested in actual hotspots on Earth and higher activity of energy, but I'm interested in creating those spaces on Earth. And that could be through collective gathering, even a lot of things that are happening politically, but also just putting minds together and creating more of a consciousness that will allow us to walk through Earth in faster or larger steps. Is this my last slide? Oh no, this is my last slide. Then this one is the window landscape. So this one's also rather large. It's maybe like 80 inches long and has the rainbow inside of this. But I see many things inside of this. I see not only a landscape, but I also see a person lying inside of a casket. They're on their back. So it's like sometimes when you see the image one time and then you return to it, it becomes something else. I think other people see other things in it as well, which is something that abstraction lends us toward. Last thing I wanted to say is this paper that I work on is really super shiny. It's called Fujiflex. And I'm in love with it because when you see the art in person, it looks like the light is not only sitting on the paper, but also inside the paper. And it's like a polyester-based paper, kind of similar to the old Cibachrome paper, but it's just got this super gloss, and I think it's a really nice material to be working with, collapsing these particles, or collapsing the waves into particles on the paper. Okay, that's it. I'll pass it on.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you all of you for sharing your work with us today. It's inspiring, of course, to know that, artists are still making things, and I'm really happy to share that with everyone today. So my first question, this is for everyone, but as Aki mentioned, Artfare started in 2019, obviously as a virtual way to connect with artists. This preceded the pandemic, which we've all been living through. And for many of us, the vast majority of us, we've become very familiar with virtual alternatives to what we used to do. And, some of it to meet our basic needs like groceries and just communication with friends. I'm curious from the artists, but of course, Aki and Carolina, if you'd like to jump into this, please feel free. I'm curious for our artists today, how you relate to connecting with people right now. And obviously that kind of connotes like virtually, but maybe how has Artfare sort of helped keep you connected to a sense of community through the pandemic? So anyone that would like to take it, please feel free.
I guess, Nick, before going to the artist, I just wanted to make it clear that before the pandemic, we were very focused on using the platform to arrange studio visits. So we wanted to get people to go visit artist studios. And that was a big sort of point of promotion for us, was to really kind of foster these relationships. Obviously, everything changed with the pandemic for a long time. You know, the studio visits weren't happening, so we just had to move to virtual side.
It just feels like everything is virtual now.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe Young, maybe would you like to start?
Sure. So I have a lot of thoughts on that, but I kind of have embraced this moment of what are the possibilities of connecting virtually with people. And of course, in the beginning, you know, as we were all kind of at home and trying to figure out, okay, how do we, you know, whittle away our time? You know, I was really intrigued by not just artists, but other institutions, events that would find ways of translating nightlife, for example, into a virtual event. And so I've seen some really great developments in, like, you know, VR platforms, other kinds of non-Zoom gathering things. Like there's a really interesting one called Bramble, which is designed by artists and performers for performers. And I organized a queer kind of fundraiser, virtual birthday party through that platform. Liz and Carolina were there for that one. So even though we are in this kind of difficult transition period, I think it's pushing the technology in interesting ways, pushing our behaviors in interesting ways. And just one other example is I've been learning ASL throughout the quarantine period, and, you know, learning it on Zoom. But because your body movement is restricted to this small square, ASL has actually adapted. So certain signs that use the full body have to be kind of shortcutted in different ways. So as much as it's difficult not being able to be together in, you know, real-time social spaces, I think we're going to see a wave of really new ideas, both in social behavior, but also artistic production that, you know, innovates. So that's kind of the thing that I've been focusing on. And if platforms like Artfare, if institutions can also embrace what those possibilities are, that's hopefully one solution to our current time.
Excellent, thank you. Maya, I feel like you made a motion.
Yeah, I was going to say that I absolutely agree with what Young said. I think there are going to be new ways of communicating, and this will sort of get integrated. I also would like to say, like, you know, what being virtual has afforded to artists, especially in the city, like not having to move, you know, your artwork around to, you know, galleries using like the subway or a taxi or whatever it is. Like if it can be shown online, like great, you know, and that sort of gives us more opportunities where we don't have to depend on four walls and a floor to show our work, which I think Aki does with Artfare as well. But I think it's now becoming like a normal thing. I also want to say that, like, you know, I think that people forget that for artists, like, you know, it's not just producing work. Like we have to network, we run our own businesses, for a lack of better word. But for me, like not having to sort of go out and network, that has like actually been so, like, it has relieved so much stress for me, because it's like, you know, you can attend these events and you can sort of stay in the background, you can meet people, you don't have to go to these galleries, you're not taking up that much time. And that's afforded me so much more time to just focus on my practice, which has been nice for me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Liz or Tahir, did you want to add anything?
I'll just jump in and say that I'm thankful that we can still look at all of the art online, because as an artist, and I feel like artists feel this way in general, it's just so important to be just looking at tons and tons of art all the time. And because we can still do that online, I think that hasn't been taken away from us. And I'm grateful for that.
I think Tahir is kind of figuring out a tech thing at the moment. So I would like to move on to my next question and just ask, you know, a really important part, I think, of what Artfare does is the idea of making collecting a little more accessible. And I think when people think of the word collection or collector, you know, we kind of have images of like the people that live on the Upper East Side or museum board members or something. But in making that connection easier, I think we've got Tahir back. But in terms of your relationship with collectors, how has it sort of changed over time, or how have you kind of connected with like that sort of audience that just gets you, or like it's the work that you're making that audience for?
I guess
welcome.
While Tahir is working on his technology, just one observation on kind of collectors and this pandemic, and you know, this is just my own anecdotal observation. I feel like a lot of us have spent, you know, some of us way too much time at home looking at our walls, and we're trying to figure out ways to make our homes feel better. And for some people, it's putting in plants. For a lot of people, it's finding art. So I feel like there's this vacuum. There are lots of people who are stuck at their homes and they want to find meaningful art to fill their homes with, to make it feel better, as it's sort of become this new center of operation, not just for, you know, kind of well-being, but it's also this productivity that we have, you know, we're all working from home. And it's kind of transforming that space and accommodating this new normal that we're all living.
I do want to give everyone a chance to talk about that, but Aki, kind of since we're sort of on the topic, could you maybe talk a little bit about how Artfare can kind of help virtually install works in your house, or how does that process work?
So there's obviously we're, you know, everything about it is work in progress, but we do have the iOS app and we have the website that we're, you know, trying to develop as fast as we can. But with the iOS app, you have this cool feature where you can actually try and see how the artwork looks on your wall, and it looks pretty realistic. So on the top right, there's this, you know, kind of a frame that if you click on it, then you can virtually place the artwork on your wall and you can take pictures of it. It sounds gimmicky, but it's very useful when you're actually trying to fill a space with potential art that you like, because you can look at it from different angles and take pictures of it.
Totally. Well, thank you.
Sure.
But I think we've got Tahir back more kind of grounded now, but I don't know, Tahir, if you didn't catch, I just wanted to know how maybe Artfare has kind of connected you to an audience that you would like to be connected to, and the idea of collectors being a more kind of accessible group of people, not just what we kind of normally think about when we think of, you know, people that collect art.
I think with, for me, my experience with Artfare has been great. What I realized sort of at the beginning of this pandemic, I had some copper left over from the cell phone batteries and was really interested in using that to create my own ink. And I made these sort of like drawings and paintings from that. And only sort of like had them on Artfare as just sort of like a great exercise to reach out to people, just to show also like a narrative, a story around like the work itself, which I thought was great. And what I really enjoyed is that through Artfare, people who are like my friends or people who don't necessarily have the space for a steel chandelier to be suspended from their apartment, they could approach this kind of more accessible work that still has this kind of weightedness to it in terms of the materials being used. And I enjoyed the fact that like you know, it was my friends, and it was like people that know me through sort of either social media or meeting me at gallery spaces, that sort of acquired the works because they were more accessible, and you know, they could sort of do it. I feel like going through a gallery is very daunting for a lot of people. And I think like one of the things is like, if you're spending a lot of money on artwork, or you're spending money on artwork in general, at a gallery, there is this sort of sense of anxiety. And I think that Artfare, what it did, it sort of removed this sort of feeling that a lot of people get from like approaching a gallery, because galleries typically are not necessarily the sort of like warm, welcoming, like, hey, like, you know, sort of situation. It's just this. And so with Artfare, people were able to sort of, you know, understand what the price is and be able to buy it instantly.
Yeah, may I jump in really quickly to hear such a good point where you are building your collectors at the same time as collectors and curators are also noticing you. And I think one thing for, you know, when we were getting the artists on board in the early days of Artfare and convincing artists that this would be a great thing, you know, some artists that we approach said, well, I would prefer to have a gallery negotiate these things. So no, thanks. I don't sell my work online. And that's okay. However, a handful of those artists actually came back to us after the lockdown happened and moved closer to feeling okay with selling their work online, with no one really seeing it in person. And although the studio visit, as Aki mentioned, was really the paramount part of having this app, taking out that gallery where folks could come into the studio, engage in a conversation with the artist, and then bluntly, the artist would get 80 to 90% of their retail value. Mm. So that was very appealing to artists, many of the artists on the platform that have gallery representation. In fact, one of the selling points to get the artists on board was that, well, geez, I have all this back inventory that's no longer consigned by a gallery that I had a solo show 2-3 years ago at, or, you know, they have newer inventory. Maybe I can sell these framed works or this painting that has a provenance that maybe the gallery didn't sell, and it's in my own inventory. So it was a way that an artist could, you know, manage that and really strategize their consignments if they were, if they did have gallery representation, or if they didn't, like how they can, you know, work directly with the collector to maintain their retail value in a marketplace.
Thank you, Carolina. Liz, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I do actually. I really appreciate the direct connection to the collector and that direct communication, because a lot of times within the gallery world, something sells and you never meet the collector. You may not even know who collected the work. And so I like the established relationship. I actually think that the collector then becomes more engaged in the artist and may be interested in coming to their shows and down the line and purchasing further work. And I also like that Artfare already has the price listed, so that's the one thing that I think it's difficult for the artist to you know, negotiate with a collector, because many times the artist won't want to say the exact price, or like will, you know, want to offer it at a price that the collector can afford or what they want to pay. Like artists sometimes have that moment where it's difficult to talk about that. But since the price is already listed, and when the collector is going to look at the work, they're not going to try to necessarily talk you down. So, and there is the ability to give a 10% discount, which a lot of collectors do ask for, but that's not too far for the artist to go. So I appreciate the direct engagement with collectors that is offered through Artfare.
Awesome, thank you. My next question is a bit more open-ended, and I'm really curious to hear from, you know, all of our artists present today. What do you think artists need most at this moment in time? Or if it's helpful to maybe frame it in another way, like if there was something if there was sort of one major change you could make about certain organizations or traditional institutions as it stands, what would that change be?
I think that there needs to be a way where artists can also, like, I feel like collectors and gallerists and curators are able to like find artists and vet them through multiple platforms, right? But the reverse doesn't really exist, where artists can't really vet curators, galleries, or collectors. And that's something that, you know, we're actively trying to build a targeted audience, or targeted audience. And it's hard to sort of like go parse through so much information, so many profiles. And yeah, I think that kind of accessibility both ways is important.
Absolutely. Young, do you have anything to add? I'm trying to read the virtual visual cues.
Yes, I see the yellow border box moving around. Yeah, no, I completely agree with Maya. That's a really great point, because those power dynamics are often quite lopsided. And so because artists are, you know, hungry for opportunities and ways to exhibit and show their work and to build a following, oftentimes we say yes to everything, which can be a real drag on our actual time and resources. And, you know, there are also definitely situations where, you know, the artists aren't looked after, their interests are looked after either by, you know, their galleries or other curators coming in. So I really love Maya's point. And I would add that, you know, this support that many of us have been receiving throughout this past year, I think it was very eye-opening that artists also need structural support, right? Financial support. And the fact that during the pandemic, you know, artists, there was kind of a meme going around that we were the least essential worker of all the different types of workers that are out there. And so what does that mean? And, you know, if that is the case, if our livelihood is kind of on the front lines of being threatened as a performer, as an artist that's exhibiting, as a writer, as a theater maker, you know, how are our projects sustained? How do we put food on the table? And, you know, I think of art as just, you know, the thing you want to protect the most, right? It represents the best of humanity, our expression, like who we are, how we're responding to our world. And so if we don't have those very basic, you know, financial, social nets in place, you lose all of that, all of those good things. And so I know that some other nations have really good, robust programs where the government subsidize studios, for example, for artists. And New York has some things like that, where there are certain buildings that are designated for the theater industry, for example. So I'd like to see more governmental, institutional infrastructure that supports creatives in this time, because we also generate so much revenue by tourists who come to see our shows or to see, you know, live events, things like that.
A little respect, yeah. Tahir, the yellow frame keeps going over to you.
I think it's just, I was agreeing with what he was saying, and it's really hard on the phone to turn the mic on and off, but I can weigh in on this a little bit. I think outside of like structural support and basic necessities that Young very eloquently put, I think the reality for a lot of artists can be very different, and you're at different stages of your career. And I think that I can speak from my experience is that I left sort of Instagram and kind of like pushed away from like social media and bothering to sort of do that, because I think for a lot of artists, you go through these waves of whether like you want to do the social media or like these sort of things to sort of think about the business of being an artist. But I think we also need time and space to sort of ignore that and not be part of that, so that you can just concentrate on sort of the process of making and actually coming up and doing things. And I think that, you know, while technology is really amazing, this kind of dedication to this upkeep of this like avatar self can be very time consuming. And I think what happens to a lot of artists is that then, because we're sort of like subject to this analytics of like quantifiable understanding of like, oh, these many people like this or this, whatever, and that can really distract and detract from the making of your work and the making of something. So I think that we just need, you know, different artists need different things, but I think I just need space. That's what I need. So just like to be away from all of that.
I'll weigh in just on what Tahir was saying too, because I do think that the social media upkeep is intense and it does take a lot of time. And I think checking in with each other, just finding out from your own artist friends, what are you working on? What are you thinking about? What are you making? And that feedback and those conversations are really important. And there have been so many things happening on Zoom, which has been nice because there is, you're not making your work in a complete vacuum. You are able to talk to people and engage, but that social networking that did exist, even though it was a lot to keep up with, I feel like those everybody you ran into, they were touch points. And so some of those things aren't happening now in the same way. And so I think it's just good to call up your artist friends in general and say, how are you doing? What are you working on? But I also agree with what Young was talking about too. And then it is kind of interesting how it's like, oh, the artists are the least essential workers. That kind of thing is a tough thing to hear when we need this cultural capital and these voices that are communicating in ways that isn't always so overt, these conversations that are needed to be had through artists. And artists have the responsibility right now to reflect what's happening in culture and in the world. And we have that on our back. So why would people want to cut it out?
Absolutely. You know, it's interesting, you know, this entire conversation series from the Rail too is about kind of creating an archive to look at what it means to be making things in this period of time. So it's very important. I would call it very essential. Before we head over to the Q&A, I just, Aki or Carolina, was there anything else or anyone that you wanted to add before we shift to the next segment of the event? Young, please.
You know, I just wanted to echo Liz's point as well. It's so important to have a cohort. And I'm also adjunct faculty at Rutgers, and I work with graduating undergrads. And, you know, this year has really shown you need to find your people and your, you know, not just your audience, but the community of artists that you're in conversation with, whether it's about your content or your materials, your approach, and, you know, sharing resources. It's a kind of like internal mutual aid. And one thing that was really great when Artfare first started, which I appreciated, is that Aki actually hosted a barbecue at his place in Brooklyn and invited the first wave of Artfare artists to come meet each other. And we're all kind of, you know, a little bit nervous, like, what is this thing? Like, who's involved with it? You know, to Maya's point. And it was so nice to meet people in person at that time as we're all kind of starting this together and finding yet another community of artists who are very, you know, independent-minded, some working with galleries, some not. So, you know, I think any kind of platform that helps to build a community of artists for other artists is really essential.
Yeah, here. Well said. I also just can't wait till we can all hang out and have a party barbecue at some point. So, well, I can see, you know, a lot of in the general chat and direct messages, a lot of questions have come in. So I'm going to hand it over to Malvika now. And thank you, everyone, again.
Thank you so much, Nick. Young, I definitely agree with what you're saying about like the new sociality and like needing a sociality and that being the new thing that is not new, but something that has renewed attention in this current moment. I just wanted to thank you all for coming on. I'm so struck by how well curated this group of people is, which is a testament to Carolina's selection. But I feel like as you each spoke, I've just been noticing a lot of like synchronous themes of like migration, transit, labor, a lot of like, I was so happy you brought up Zarina Hashmi, because I feel like I see so much Zarina Hashmi in like Maya's work. And then Young, as you were talking about your work, maybe not in like a literal way, but when you were describing the sort of the erasure of the unphotographable, like present and past landscape, it just, to me, it smacks of Zarina Hashmi as well. So I feel like this is like a beautifully put together conversation. Before we go to, we've got a couple questions in from the audience, but I wanted to be greedy and just ask a question to you all, which has perhaps a little less to do with Artfare and more to do with the work that you've shared. But I feel like all four of you are using collage in like really intriguing and parallel ways, but not exactly the same way. So I'm thinking of like, you know, Young, the way yours, I feel like you're kind of doing a kind of collaging, and it proposes maybe like an alternative future, or like, you know, it has a kind of political content. Like Maya, I'm obviously obsessed with it, how your images function. They make me think of like kind of like Amar Chitra Kata, like books. And Tahir, like the photocopies of your immigration documents, that to me feels like it's functioning on a logic of collage. So I guess I wanted to ask, like, how did each of you come to this kind of, all four of you come to this kind of like collage, assemblage, mixage kind of form? And what do you think it provides you kind of thematically, or how would you articulate kind of how you're instrumentalizing it?
I'm jumping in quickly because it's funny that you bring up collage, because I just was talking with someone the other day about how collage is what's happening during the pandemic. It seems like there's so many people that even weren't making collage but are now doing it. And it's something that's happening in the collective consciousness. Like as artists, I think we're tapped in. It's like this sense of what was happening in history in many different places all over the world, long before communication existed in the way that it does now. And these movements, I think, are coming to the forefront through a lot of artists. And even though it's a formal thing, collage, it's like this way of piecing together these fragments that I think all of us are experiencing right now. It's like, how are we gonna line things up? How are we gonna make things work? How are we going to put things back together, and in what way? And there's a lot of power in that. And it's just interesting that you brought up that exact formal word, but it's happening with many artists, not just the four of us right now.
Right, so it's like something in the zeitgeist.
I think so. Yeah, I definitely agree with Liz. For me, I think I was, you know, modifying these machines and like assembling them. And I wanted the medium two-dimensionally to mimic that assembly. So I decided to go with collage, but I also feel like it's an opportunity to change something that seems set in time. So you can have those intergenerational conversations, because there's definitely a gap, you know. I'm sure that 20 years down the line, something that I'm doing is going to offend someone who's 20 years younger than me, and I'm glad to be a part of that critique. I'm looking forward to it, because I feel like it's a learning opportunity, and being involved in collage, I feel like gives you that opportunity to critique yourself, but also what was happening in the past.
I love that so much.
I'll step in and talk a little bit about collage. I think that there is just an overwhelmingly large amount of data and information that we need to process. And, you know, given sort of, you know, post-imperialism and post-colonialism, actually we're still in colonialism, but like after all kind of our histories being either like partially and entirely erased or not given to us. There's a lot of information that we are kind of processing in history, as like Liz mentioned. And we have to do this kind of quickly and immediately in a way that we can communicate fast. And I think collage definitely fits in this sort of like realm of being able to assemble and come up with ideas fast and quickly, so that you can communicate that to an audience immediately. And I think that it just helps people sort of try to make sense of things. And the rate in which we read images is so fast that, reading a collage these days is just incredibly quick, and people can do it very, very quickly. And so you can pack in more information based off of, the history of this image, or the arrangement of the image, or the design vernacular that you're referring to, like pretty quickly. And so you can combine these ideas very quickly.
Yeah, I'll just add very quickly. Yeah, it's just an opportunity to collapse different contexts together. And as Maya was saying, a way to undo maybe harmful, established imagery or the ways that images communicate a history. And for me, especially this year, it's a way to collapse geographic distance. And so it's a way of kind of bringing these ideas, communities together in the same space, even though we may be very distant.
Oh, I love that. I feel like you just gave me so many like little bits and pieces of like things that I'll remember for later. Our next question returns to Artfare and will come from our lovely audience member, Tabitha Soren. And Tabitha, you should be able to turn on your microphone now.
Hi, I just wanted to thank the artists, Liz, Tahir, Maya, and Young, for showing your work to a whole bunch of strangers. I'm sure you've got some friends watching, but I know that it can be a very vulnerable position to be in. And as kind as the Brooklyn Rail folks are, I just appreciate the openness to explain the work and expose it to all of us. My question, well, actually, before I get to that, I thought Nick Bennett might want to know that the painting behind his head from my monitor makes you look like you have this beautiful crown coming off the top of your head in a very gorgeous way. I don't know if it was happening to me. I'd want someone to tell me. Maybe that's intentional. So Aki and Carolina, I was wondering just some brass tacks questions, like what are the requirements for an artist to participate on Artfare? And you mentioned earlier something about 80 to 90% of the fee stays with the artist. So I was wondering how you came up with that number, because obviously most galleries are 50%. And then I was also wondering what you do to reach out to collectors, because it is it can be a very Tony group of 1%ers who refuse to leave Chelsea or the Upper East Side, and might be older and might not want to they're not so educated in virtual stuff. So I just wondered what the strategy there was. Thank you.
Aki, do you mind if I jump in here?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, first, let's kind of reinvent the way we think of collectors. For Artfare, it is accessible for generational folks as well. I mean, having an app may be a little intimidating on someone's iPhone or going onto the web, yet we still provide a service of like invoicing if we needed. So there's some workaround for the 1%ers. However, we're let Aki speak to how we're trying to build more of a clientele for those collectors, for the artists. The artists also bring on, as Tahir was mentioning, And I know that Liz has made some sales as well that were directly related to studio visits that they had that was more for consignment that wasn't with a gallery. It was just a connection that they were able to make with the collector. And then they sold through Artfare. So there's a lot of different avenues that the collectors are coming from. Also, in terms of the rubrics of how the curators choose the artists that are on Artfare, I mentioned early on in the conversation that, I mean, there's no set of credentials that we're looking for. There is a fit. There's certainly artists that first and foremost have an active studio practice, because as we mentioned, it's about coming to the studio, and whether that studio is in your bedroom or whether the studio is in a different space in your home, you are actively engaged in your making. Conceptually, you're actively engaged in your research, and skillfully you are, best to be able to communicate visually what you're saying and how you're saying it, which oftentimes comes from someone that has that practice. And therefore solo shows, group exhibitions, potential residencies, education sometimes comes from a BFA and an MFA, and most of the artists do have that, but we do not look towards having that be a requirement for from the submissions. But often we reach out to artists and ask them after they've won awards, or we'll look at lists as curators and we'll see who's up and coming and who's hot and who do we want on the platform, to create that community, to help vet folks that are coming in as young collectors or unknowing collectors, new collectors, and kind of making that easier for them. Whereas, Saatchi, for instance, has so many, or other platforms, it's there is no curatorial, or it's just everyone that submits can self identify as an artist. And so the application itself is, there are a lot of things, but there's often that fit, for instance. Yes. And then the 80 to 90%. So a lot of legacy artists that we asked on receive 80%, and there's a 3% credit card fee as well. So it would be something like 77%. And then there's artists that have applied that we've been building this service, and it's $20 a month. And then they get 90%. Minus 3%, so in 87% of their retail value, with the opportunity to be able to give 10 or 20% discounts. Did I answer almost everything?
Yeah. I think from my perspective on the collectors, we sort of think there are two kinds of collectors. There's obviously the experienced ones who live on the Upper East Side and are still seeking that prestigious gallery experience where they're put on a pedestal. And, we're totally open to those. And we've had some of those types of sales that are obviously a lot more hands-on. But I think what we're really seeking to do is we want to try to find these sort of aspirational collectors that really identify with art, may find the gallery experience quite a bit intimidating. And frankly, during the pandemic, even the galleries are having a very, very difficult time. And they do a lot of great work. It's just that in practice, having a gallery these days is very difficult. So we try to identify these people who seek to have that meaningful connection to the art that they buy. They want to understand it in a good way, in a way directly from the source, if you will. And we sort of want them to be able to go on Artfare and feel that they can trust their own taste, that it's being curated and it's all professional artists. And if they find that something that they like, they can feel good about it. Even if it might be a little expensive, they can put it in their home, into a special place, and it will have this meaningful story behind it that they can share with other people, and they can enjoy it while they're spending more time at home.
I feel like that was a very, very thorough explanation of every part of this orchestration. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. I feel like Dorothy Reese Faison also had a kind of Similar question. She writes, I'm impressed by the level of quality and depth of the artists curated. Now that virtual has been normalized, looking forward to art fair expanding where artists are located. And she asks, like, when do you see including Europe? When do you see branching out of the US?
So for us, it's, we're, doing this with limited resources. So it's whatever we make, we put back in, and we're, spending our free times working on this. So we're in the process of trying to raise some capital and get more resources behind it so we can expand and sort of take the company to the next level. But it remains to be seen, and we're sort of focused on doing everything the right way. So we're not trying to grow for growth's sake. So right now, it's really just in the US, and maybe late this year or maybe next year, we could see going into Europe, but it sort of really all depends on how everything goes through the year.
Amazing, thank you. I think for our final question, we'll go to our publisher and the captain of this vessel, Phong H. Bui. And Phong, you should be able to turn on your microphone whenever you'd like.
Thank you, Malvika. Thank you, you guys. Very eloquent and very generous. I don't think I have much to add to this conversation, except that I'm super pleased what we've been doing, because as Malvika texted me just not long ago, that this March is actually marked exactly a year since Trump announced a 15-day quarantine, and have, along with that hideous deployment of the world, that phrase that we all hate, social distancing. So it's apparent to us that art is really practiced and mobilizing the most essential human creative energy, which is slowness. Slowness. When we were being slowed by the pandemic, we realized that Trump's cleverness and his whole strategy is to deploy it in, speed for power. This is something we also know about Mussolini learning how to do the same through his friendship with Mandaretti, the founder of Futurism. What is future art? Futurism, it's speed and technology. So it's always in these people's alchemy, and our own alchemy is to slow down and to make art. It takes time to make a work of art. It takes time to appreciate a work of art, sometimes even more time than the one, the made by the artist. So this is what we've been doing, and we will keep doing even more so. So getting together like this is part of that slowness. Slowness is I would say, it's a natural DNA in our alchemy. So it's really terrific that we can take time to be together and talk about the thing that we love. And that's how we're gonna heal everything. So I think that we don't always forget in the history. History doesn't repeat itself. It's also enlightened us. So this is the moment where we can do more of gathering, talk about art, and amplify the love and creation of culture. So I'm just very happy that Artfare, Aki, Carolina, Tamil, Maya, Young, Liz, who else? Carolina, of course, I say that already twice. Who else I'm missing? But let's do it again. And keep up the good work. And back to you for the poetry reading, which is our tradition.
Yeah, thank you, Phong. And thank you, everyone, for your participation and presence and generosity with time. I feel like I have so many questions I would love to ask you each about your work, but Zoom waits for no man. So at the Rail, we've had a tradition historically of ending our lunches with a poem. And one of the silver linings of this pandemic, though I sort of hesitate to frame it that way, One of the silver linings of this pandemic is since physical distance is less of a barrier, we get to invite actual living poets and writers to share their work with us. So today I have the pleasure of welcoming today's poet laureate, Darien Hsu Gee, to the stage, author of 5 novels that have been translated into 11 languages and a memoir, Allegiance. She's the 2019 Poetry Society of America Chapbook Fellowship winner for Other Small Histories, which I'll drop in the chat. I'm very fascinated. She's also the 2015 Hawaii Book Publishers Ka Palapala Poekolo Award of Excellence for writing, the Hawaii Memoir Award winner. And Gee lives with her family on the Big Island of Hawaii and is joining us today through the magic of the internet. So give it up for Darien. And Darien, you should be able to turn on your microphone now.
Great. Hi, everybody. I just want to thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. It's really exciting to see everybody's work, Young, Maya, Tahir, Liz, and I love to hear about process. So that was really, really awesome. Thank you for doing that. I'm going to read 2 short poems. The first is from my poetry chapbook called Other Small Histories. It was published last year by the Poetry Society of America. It's a collection of poems that follows the women in my matrilineal line, including my grandfather's 3 wives, and the secrets the women had to keep in their bodies. My grandmother was his 2nd wife, and the poem I'm going to read you is about the 3rd wife, who was my inspiration for this work. Afterlife. After the war, there was just enough room to start over. How easy it would have been for Julia to disappear, a corporeal reminder of what can happen to any modern marriage. She could vanish, an apparition, a wisp of thought, a question mark. He might doubt she ever existed at all. It's not the money. Both Julia and the other wife work, manage their own expenses, their separate houses, their children, their desolation. They live parallel lives that cross at a single point, him. Julia accepts her fate. She does not leave. Her few friends question her judgment. Why suffer? You can take care of yourself. Go while you're still young. Julia does not expect them to understand. Her life has been built this way. There is no tearing it down now. They've all been through so much. Why not make it forever? They could stay tied together in the afterlife. 3 plots, 3 souls. Make that 4. Don't forget the village wife. Company for eternity. One big, happy family. And then the next and final poem I'm going to read appeared in Poetry Northwest. It's called Take 30 with Food. My mother had heart failure last week. She told me as an afterthought, having twice said, I'm fine now, but I didn't understand, so I asked, what's fine now? 30 pounds of water weight, difficulty breathing, an irregular heartbeat. Her bookshelf now cluttered with bottles of Chinese herbs rolled into small black balls. Take 30 with food. Stinky teas and poultices to press against a wound, needles as thin as a hair or thick as a nail. They quiver when they break the skin. It happened after my uncle died. She watched his funeral on the computer, beamed in terabytes across the country, ended up in the emergency room that night. She turned 80 while in the hospital. This was practice, she told me, so I'll be ready when the time comes. Her nephew, her father, her mother, her older brother. Every death reveals something new. Colon cancer kept secret, 2 uncles, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, lousy hearts, blood in the bowels, a lazy eye, ears that won't stop ringing. When I update my medical history with the click of a mouse, my Western doctor tells me to come in for more tests. My Chinese doctor covers my back with glass jars of swirling smoke. I tell myself I will be immune. My Americanness will save me. I eat kale, rub bioidentical progesterone on my skin, meditate with an app on my phone. My pantry is filled with plastic bins of vitamins, some so large I have to cut them in 2. At night, I run my hands over my body, repeat affirmations, wonder what it will take to change my own history. Thank you.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Sharon. You have such a radio play voice. My God. Thank you for sharing those with us. Everyone check out her book. And thank you so much to Maya, Tahir, Young, Liz, Carolina, and Aki, and of course to my comrade Nick Bennett, and most of all to all of you who tuned in today in the audience and in the chat. We're celebrating the Rail's 20th anniversary this year. We're celebrating all year. It's a year-long birthday party, so please consider making a contribution to our anniversary fundraising campaign to keep the Rail and our special projects free, relevant, and independent. And please join us again tomorrow when we'll be joined by painter and sculptor Richard Tuttle in conversation with artist and writer Louis Bloch and Rail art scene editor Amanda Goulibizi. We'll conclude with a poetry reading by Gabriela Jaregui, and that will be, as always, at 1 p.m. right here in the Zoom. Other than that, thank you all so much for coming. You can now unmute your microphones and say goodbye as you leave. But yeah, Aki, Carolina, thank you for making this up and sharing this with us. Oh, I'm getting a reverb.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye,
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Darien.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you.